Well, as the title implies, I'm going to be talking about the long-run impacts of same-race teachers. This paper's actually been floating around, or some version of it's been floating around for a while, but we kind of drastically changed it, and this is kind of the maiden voyage. So if I look confused, it's because I am. Uh, so in particular, we're looking at what is the effect of having a black teacher in elementary school on black students' educational attainment or educational outcomes. We're going to look at high school graduation, college intent, which is a measure in one of our data sets, college and entrance exams like ACT and SATs, and then because of the generosity of Susan Dynarski and Diane Schanzenbach, we're also going to be looking at college enrollment, which is one of the new features of our data. So a motivation for this work is that there are these troubling and persistent racial educational attainment gaps. We can think of at least 3 reasons why these might be problematic. One is that education makes people's lives better on a number of different dimensions, and so could reduce inequality. If we don't care about inequality because we're economists, there are social costs to having large swaths of a population that are uneducated. You can think about labor market productivity. We can think about costs of imprisonment, a host of other things. And then this kind of third reason, which I think is a little bit more related to a lot of the really interesting papers that I've been seeing here. There's this concern, I think, and we'll kind of add to this concern that some of these gaps could reflect aspirations, expectations, or information gaps, which means that it might not be ability or some kind of a credit constraint that's leading people to to invest less in their education. They might be underinvesting or suboptimally investing in their educational attainment or in their human capital because of faulty information, and that seems terribly inefficient. Another motivation is that we want to continue on this long path of trying to understand why some teachers are more effective than other teachers. Existing literature has shown that teachers matter a lot. They're kind of considered in the ed policy literature the most important school-based input. We know that they vary widely in their effectiveness. They're sort of, sometimes people call it quality, and then other people don't like that word. So I'll kind of just flip back and forth. The problem with that literature, I think, is that there aren't a whole lot of observable characteristics that predict which teachers are going to be better than others, which is tricky then for policy, right? Because you don't know how to sort of produce or generate or hire even the right teachers who are more effective. So teacher race is one interesting exception. We know that black teachers, for example, can boost achievement for black students. Usually, or actually almost exclusively until our paper, we're looking at end of year exams. So this is looking in the short run. This is interestingly mirrored in sort of other demographic match types of situations. We know that teacher gender can matter or can help on different dimensions. So women, might be encouraged into STEM fields if they come into more contact with female scientists, stuff like this. So these motivations are going to lead me to our research question. So do these race match effects extend to longer run outcomes? And if so, through what mechanisms are they going to be operating? And these are both going to be important questions for thinking about policy, right? So if this were just limited to end of year test scores and they faded out, which is actually, this has been shown in many different cases that sometimes these effects do fade out. They sort of, sometimes teachers can be really good on some dimension and then the kids do great on the test score and then 3 years later there's another test score and it's all gone. So if it faded out, then who cares? Then we're done with that solution. The other thing is, if we want to use results about long run outcomes or long run benefits to develop policy, we need to understand something about how this operates, and I'll be a little bit more specific about why. Okay, so to answer these questions, we're going to do 3 things. We're going to first of all leverage the Tennessee Star class size experiment, which I'm sure most of you have heard of because it's been around like forever. In 1986, they randomized teachers and students to classes in order to study how class size can affect student achievement. A byproduct or sort of an unintended consequence of this is that they randomly assigned students to teachers of different races, which is something that Tom D sort of figured out relatively recently. So you can use this as a nice experiment of what happens when you randomly assign a kid to a teacher of the same race. Next, we're going to do a bit of a dive, I don't know if I want to say a deep dive. We're going to do a bit of a dive into a literature that's existed for a long time, far longer than whenever economists came sniffing around to try to figure this out. So sociologists, people working on ed policy, critical race theorists have been thinking about why black teachers seem to be good for black students. And one thing that came out of this work that we found particularly interesting is that they made a distinction between being an effective teacher versus being a role model. And so what we try to do here, sometimes it's called black pedagogy, like if you're talking to someone, but you never write that, you call it culturally relevant pedagogy. I was told by one of my co-authors. So the model is basically going to try to distinguish between these two things. It's a simple toy model. And the basic idea is that black teachers are a role model effect is going to be a transmission of information, okay? So a black teacher is going to essentially serve as a crucial counterexample for students whose perceptions are that there are low returns to effort in the education production function, okay? So we'll model this as an initial prior belief that the returns to effort are low, and then a black teacher can be a signal that they're actually higher. The model can then generate some testable implications, in particular about dosage. So what happens if you have a second teacher? In a nutshell, and I'll kind of show you how we do it, but in a nutshell, what you get is that if teacher effectiveness is really what's undergirding these effects, then a second teacher should be sort of more effective than, just as effective as the first one, maybe a little less. We do everything linearly, so it should be the same amount of effective, but we can quibble about that when I get there. Whereas if it's a role model effect and it's this information transmission story, there are conditions under which the first update is the crucial one, and after that, you don't sort of need to learn that information again. Like you've updated your beliefs, you understand now that effort pays off, that need not be repeated. It turns out that this is important for policy. Why? Well, so this literature, this paper in particular, has been used to think about, to justify efforts to diversify the teaching workforce. That sounds lovely. We should definitely do that. There is no pipeline for black teachers right now. Certainly not in the numbers we would need to make a difference. So we need to understand not only, whether we can, so basically what we need to understand is, can we leverage some of the lessons we learned here about why black teachers are mattering using the teaching workforce that we currently have, not the one that we're wishing that we had. And the role model effect story is telling us, number one, that maybe we can sort of cleverly reallocate teachers so more of them are exposed to more students. Moreover, we can ask questions about whether white teachers can be trained using some of these lessons to leverage some of these impacts. The third thing we're going to do is actually replicate some of our results using administrative data from North Carolina. So you don't have this nice experiment, but you have like 2 orders of magnitude more observations and more variables. So you can sort of further probe some of these mechanisms and test a couple additional hypotheses. So the spoiler here, this is where I present like our results, but I'm going to do it in a cartoon because this cartoonist like saw our old version of our paper and wrote a cartoon about it, and that was sort of the coolest thing that's ever happened to me, like ever in my life. So I wanted to share it with you. So he kind of gets the point. So he's like, there's these long run effects. So he's talking about this study floating around and how it looks like having one black teacher can really matter. Having one black teacher can matter. Sometimes it's precisely one, consistent with this kind of role model effect story. that the second one doesn't really matter. So he's saying that, he had only one black teacher and it was a sub, and this sub was an aspiring cartoonist, and sort of he should be a co-author. In conjunction with this, he realized that role model effects are key, because he said, he can't reiterate enough how much it meant for him to see someone who looks like him doing what he wanted to do. Which is a little bit now how we're seeing role model effects. These black teachers are counterexamples to students who might think there are no past effort. They're essentially a counterexample in the sense that they are part of the black middle class, and they're saying, yes, you can actually become a black educated professional. So if you thought that was impossible, well, I'm showing you that isn't impossible. Okay, so the outline for the rest of, any questions until now, or should I just keep on going? All right, so the outline for the rest of the talk. I'm going to talk about the Tennessee Star data and the methods we're going to use. They're like exceedingly simple. I think this is the most reduced form paper I've ever been a part of in my life, which is hard actually if you mostly do structural, because you don't really know. I mean, it's another thing. My reduced form counterparts are sometimes surprised at the things I don't know, having done structural. So, okay, so then I'll tell you about our main results. I would like to talk about the logic of our very simple toy model. I'll probably go really quickly through what we did with the North Carolina data, just because that's all about robustness and sort of corroborating results in a new state and in a new time period and with richer data, and also a new identification strategy. These are all about kind of benefits of having this race match effect. In the conclusion, I'm going to talk about some of the costs, which I've alluded to, this lack of a pipeline, and we do some back of the envelope calculations to talk about how much this would actually cost, and then some other concerns that I have with our results.
I'm sorry, I have just one question.
Yes.
So, middle-class black kids a lot of them would have parents who were teachers, ministers, relatives who are teachers and so forth. So I assume that this effect would only be relevant to people who live in, say, really highly disadvantaged neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Where social networks don't have those kind of people.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. So there's a couple of things. Number one is that so the Tennessee data is pretty bad in the sense that there isn't a lot of data. It's a small sample. And the information we have is quite crude, so we don't know a lot about the parents. So that's one issue. But we know that they tend to be disadvantaged. I'll show you that in the data. So that would be like the right group. The nice thing about the North Carolina data is we can see a little bit about that. And what we do find is that if your parent is college educated, this is going to not have as much of an effect. So the North Carolina results are limited, or they're not limited to, but they're just far stronger for poorer kids. So that would be in line with what you're saying. So we've been asked why you use the North Carolina data. You have this nice experiment, and it's like, well, because we have endogeneity issues. You have to use an IV or something like it. You have to find some sort of exogenous variation, but it allows you to sort of think through other things that you cannot do with the Tennessee data. Was there another question? Yeah.
This might best refer to the model.
Yeah, sure.
But because right now you're making a distinction between the role model effect versus the culturally relevant pedagogy effect.
Sure.
And just even see the cartoon reminded me that even in the role model world, there will be some sort of a scaling up in terms of how it interacts with subjects. Like how it's seeing math teacher.
Yeah.
Different than seeing.
Yeah. I don't know how much I'm going to be able to satisfy that kind of concern, especially, I mean, the model's pretty rudimentary and more about fixing ideas, but yeah, why don't we defer it to that, but not because I'm trying to get away from the question, but I want you to see sort of how bad the model is before you critique it, because it's, all right.
You don't want us to work hard.
I mean, if you're gonna, it's probably worse than you think, is what I'm saying. So you should really critique it. Let's really get in there. Okay, so Tennessee Star was this class size experiment. Students and teachers were randomly assigned to classrooms in 3 different treatment arms. This is in 1986, by the way. So you either had a small class, a regular size class, and a regular size class plus a teacher's aide. Now, all of the randomization happened within school. So schools elected to participate, and then within schools, there was this randomization. And this is important because it means number one is that differences across schools are not something we need to worry about. But the other thing is that it's not representative of Tennessee schools. I mean, they tend to be low-income urban schools. Schools participate over 4 years. There are so many problems with this data set. And we're going to try to be very careful. Schools participate over 4 years. So one thing that happens is that there's these kind of like new entrants in the first grade and in the second grade and the third grade. So some of our work will be to get rid of all of those and only look at the people who are randomized in kindergarten. It turns out that the kindergarten randomization was really good. Like there was almost full compliance, and that's like that's the sharpest kind of experiment that you can work with. So there have been a bunch of studies on this. I think the sort of seminal, like rigorous, probably just means economic study was that's totally my co-author's wording. Was this Kruger paper that showed these pretty sizable effects. Larger gains for low income and students of color, diminishing returns to subsequent small classes, and he also was able to kind of show that the random assignment worked very well, at least in the first year.
What does it mean for it to work well?
It means like people complied. When they were assigned to a small class, they went to the small class. So afterwards, there was a little bit of like movement. Okay. I think it was like 98 or 99. I mean, it was like they all did it with their, maybe they didn't realize what was going on. And so after the first year, probably some parents tried to get into the smaller classes, things like that. And yes?
Although the contrast in class size that was realized was smaller than they had anticipated. So
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, there was some slippage.
Okay, so that's probably an underestimate of the effect then, if we believe that that's true.
I think the Kruger paper does use the randomization to identify the effect of the actual realized.
Oh yeah, that is true, and we do that as well. Actually, in some of our specifications, we do exactly that. Just in order to control for class size, not as our sort of key variable, but yeah, you'll see that we do that as well. So there's been a few other things. So there have been, because there is some randomization, this Chetty did this sort of class quality effect that looks at college and earnings. So that's some long run stuff. There's been some work on things like dosage and timing that shows there might be some dosage. Timing doesn't seem to matter a whole lot. And it's been used for different reasons. Student-teacher race match was looked at in this D paper because he was the one who sort of sorted out that there was this randomization to teacher race, but he was kind of looking at teacher perceptions. Again, these proximate or these short-run outcomes. So we're going to look at the long-run outcomes. We can look at college entrance exams. College enrollment and graduation, this because of a match with the National Student Clearinghouse data, which basically keeps track of college going in the US. And we can also look at high school dropouts. And there are massive missing data issues for high school dropouts. So we're gonna do it anyways, and we'll show you kind of what we get. And we think that we actually have reasonable results, but we caveat this a lot. We know who dropped out for 30%. That means for 63% of the kids, we don't know what happened to them. You have to make a guess. So this isn't good. The difference is that for college enrollment, National Student Clearinghouse can catch all the ones, including the ones that disappeared. Or not all of them, but we'll talk about that in a minute. We'll look a little bit at medium run outcomes. That'll be like one slide because it's, again, these missing data issues. And here's basically the variables we have. We know student race, sex, if they, too much ed policy. Free and reduced price lunch receipt means you're poor. See, I've started getting used to these acronyms. We know the cohort of star entry. So did you start out in kindergarten in 1986, or were you a first grader in 1987? We know teacher race, sex, experience, degree. I meant there's actually like this is supposed to be career ladder. So there are these, like if a teacher performed well in an evaluation, she might get sort of to a higher rung on a ladder. So it's not going to be completely collinear with experience. We can control for that. And then we know class size. Class type is in what were they randomized to. and class race composition, which we can use as controls. Next data source is National Student Clearinghouse, which collects students on information on U.S. students' post-secondary education. So Dynarski was the one who did this match, and therefore was the one who was able to help us out by giving us these data because we asked nicely. So she's kind of a hero. Now, there are a couple of issues with coverage. One is that when they did the match, or when these kids would have gone to college, there were 20% of colleges for Tennessee students that were not covered. There's an even bigger issue if, so there's an even bigger issue with graduation. So a lot of them recorded enrollment but not graduation. So so we don't really have very strong graduation results, and it's not clear if they just didn't graduate or if it's because the schools didn't record that. There's also some name and date of birth missing data for the Tennessee Star cohort, which makes it difficult to match with them. Okay. These are all the problems. So we handle these in different ways, but I just want you to be familiar with all the kind of matching issues. We also, but this is an issue because we can't distinguish between no college versus not captured by NSE. So if the ones who are not captured by NSE actually did go to college and maybe, I don't know, had white teachers, then we're going to be screwing up, right? So we're going to be misestimating things. So that's just a concern to have in mind. There is some earlier work that is suggesting that this missingness is not a problem. So there's the integrated post-secondary education data system, which is the universe of people in the U.S. and college, and this was used by Dynarski in another paper to kind of cross-validate what happened with the NCS data, and she kind of shows that the 20% that are missing here look a lot like the ones that are found here. So that maybe is at least on observables. We also think that another way to hit this is to say, well, we might miss your college enrollment, but at least we can look at your SAT and ACT test taking where we see whether or not you did it as a way to validate what we're doing. Okay, so some means. This is, the full sample is roughly 4,000 kids. Just a couple of things to point out. They're poor. Roughly half are this kindergarten cohort. About 12% are missing a name or a date of birth, which makes the match a little trickier. Here's the kind of assignment. You'll notice that if you look at, in the second panel, this is classroom school characteristics, there are differences between having had a black or a white teacher in the first year. So for example, it's going to be much more likely in, let's see, and if you had a white teacher, the percent black in your class is going to be 75%, right? So there are going to be whiter schools. And that is why you want to be doing the randomization within school, not across schools, because there are differences. So,
sorry.
Yes?
If you have a white teacher, then the class size is going to be 75% black?
Yes.
So they're whiter schools?
Those are slightly whiter schools versus 90.
Oh, I see, I get it.
Yeah.
What is the interplay between race and gender? Are black male teachers free?
They are almost exclusively female teachers. There is absolutely no inference you can do with. Now, in the North Carolina data, it's also predominantly female, but we can actually do a little bit of inference there, which shocked us. There's suggested evidence that the gender and the race match can have a stronger effect, but you can't reject that they're the same, but the numbers are pretty wild. Yeah.
So I was playing with the star data too. We talked about this at dinner, and what I think I noticed that perhaps you want to consider here is that within school, okay, the randomization is not perfectly balanced. So that is, there are some schools that the control and treatment group is 50-50, and the other schools are not 50-50. And it turned out that the share of control versus treatment classrooms actually affect the treatment. So the treatment
that was kind of what
bigger.
This Penny guy argued. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
So the treatment is bigger whenever the fraction of treatment classes versus control groups is smaller.
Okay. That I haven't looked at. That's interesting.
And yeah, that's something you should.
You can solve that through weighting.
Yeah, that's. Yeah, I don't know if I want to solve it. It's interesting. That's interesting. Okay, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Okay, so here's that terrible number. High school grad observed 37%. Of those who are observed, 68% graduated. SATs around 777, and then we can look at enrolled in 2-year, which is actually where we see some action. This is post-secondary. We can look at persisted to the 2nd year, which is a measure of kind of that you might actually finish. But we have these like kind of low numbers of actually earning a degree. Yeah.
So, the second row, it's 68% graduate, conditional on observing graduation?
Yes, conditional on observing 68% graduated.
Okay. And why would you not observe high school graduation?
They leave the school. They leave the study. They weren't followed. These people are. I mean, so one thing you can like look at that might be useful is look how many people are entering the cohort in grades 1, 2, and 3. Those are kids who change schools. That's a lot. These are very unstable homes. So that's a lot what it, and it wasn't. That's not what they were. They were looking at test scores, so they weren't following them. Some of them left the state, some of them left the school system, but
But you can observe college enrollment.
yes, that's the idea. Well, for most, subject to the critiques of that, yeah. That's why the college enrollment data is like a better deal with this. And also the ACT, SAT, we see that as well. If we have their date of birth and if we have their name, we can do that. Or if we have at least one of them, yeah.
The graduation rates actually don't look that bad.
Mm-hmm.
There's a little bit of problem if you try to rely on the iPads, which is they only tell you full-time
I see.
graduation rates.
Fair enough.
Most of these kids are part-time and they don't show up in that.
Fair enough. Okay.
So, I mean, at least for Chicago, this was going to be.
Okay. Yeah, that might be right. That might be right. So we do an actual balance test where the outcome here is whether or not you were assigned to a black teacher. And so in the first one, we don't even control for school fixed effects, which we should. School cohort fixed effects, actually. And we still get that, the joint, we can't reject at all. All of these things are 0. We look at gender, poverty, small class, and missingness of information. When you control for, when you add any school cohort fixed effects, the balance gets even better, which is actually the proper way to do it. And you can do that with by males and females separately. So the balance was pretty good, subject to the critique that you brought up, which is interesting. Okay, so this is basically, this is what we're going to use for most of the study, which is an outcome, such as it's a linear probability of an outcome like college enrollment for student I, cohort J, school K. You have these school cohort fixed effects, some controls in some specifications, and then this delta is what we care about, which is it indicates if a black teacher, if a student had a black teacher in their initial star year. Okay, we'll standard clustered errors by entry classroom, but we'll even play around with that a little bit, and then these X's will include some of the things that I was discussing before. Again, like the first compliance, the first year, the students were compliant and there are no attrition issues. So we actually start out only looking at kindergarten, and because that's the absolute safest thing you can do, but you're losing a lot of sample size. You see a slightly larger effect. These are percentage points because it's a linear probability model. And we see a slightly larger effect if you have controls. Then to increase sample size, we look at everybody else, so people who came in grades 1, 2, and 3. And we get a bit more power, but similar results. There is no evidence that the effects are different if you got it in kindergarten versus in another one of these grades. These are all 0. Yes?
What's the mean of the dependent variable college enrollment?
Mean of college enrollment is 33.
But this is a really large effect, no?
Yeah, these are large effects. These are really large effects.
So what do you
Well,
do you make of this?
Yeah, I mean, that's why we're going to have to put some theory on this. I mean, they're really large effects.
I misunderstood something about students that came in, transferred in.
So students that so in the first specification, we don't look at students who transferred in. We just look at the ones who came in were in kindergarten. That's half the sample. And then there were students who so that group moved to first grade. It's now 1987, and some people came to the school, and they were also randomly assigned.
And do they exhibit different responses to the pregnancy?
Not really. I mean, that's why we kind of do it separately for each group, but it doesn't look like they do.
That seems to be an important thing to emphasize.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of what we were looking at here is does it matter?
I meant with respect to your interpretations, because Because after all, you start off by saying that the ones who transfer in have less stable family backgrounds.
Oh, I'm not saying that they necessarily have less stable family background. I'm saying that this population in general does, because a lot of the kindergarten ones also left after a few years. So,
I guess I think it's worth exploring that more. Because when there's a,
what do you have in mind?
well, suppose that I looked at kids who stayed in the same school the whole time, and I found one effect, and kids who move in and out, there's a different effect. I think there's sufficiently large literature on the differences between families and kids around than others.
Yeah.
Something you'd want to think about.
So one of the things that
this is not negative about your results.
No. I'm not taking it that way.
Triangulating mechanisms, those types of heterogeneities, if they're present or if they're absent, are useful.
So there's an interesting. So one of the things I'm going to show you in a few minutes when we're looking at the high school graduation results is that having a black teacher being randomly assigned a black teacher in kindergarten predicts not leaving the school. So that's, I think, a little bit in line with what you're saying. That, I mean, suppose that having a black teacher matters for a number of reasons. One of them is that they, communicate better with the parents. And then the parents or provide some kind of support, for the parent or understand the pitfalls that they're going to be facing. So we do seem to find some evidence that this attachment to school is higher. So yeah, I think that's in line with what you're saying. But yeah, totally worth exploring.
Do you know whether there's two parents in the home? You have no data of that type.
Is this about just the primary teacher's race or also the teacher's
Primary teacher, classroom teacher.
So what about the aid of the race of the aid, and is that anything about the teacher race? Because they got rid of the
Interesting.
aid, right?
Actually, I don't know the answer to that question. I actually have no idea. That's such a good question. I should totally know the answer to that. I don't know. That's a great question. Yeah.
So this includes only black students?
Yes. Right now we're looking only at black students. We're going to talk about white students in a minute.
Do you know what the gender role model effects are? Like, how big are those?
In this data set, nothing.
No, in the literature, I mean. What are people... I'm trying to understand
Oh, like how big are they?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, I don't know. I don't know. Does anybody else know?
You could do a Hurley's cut by sex.
Yeah, we can cut by males and females and get no stars probably. But we could look at the magnitudes. In general, so in the other data set, we tend to find bigger effects for males, and there we can actually do, and so even bigger if it's a male teacher, which there aren't that many, but actually female teachers and black female teachers seem to have a bigger effect on black males. Actually, that drives the entire effect in the North Carolina data, interestingly, and so that that make of that what you will. Yeah.
So how does the result compare with quality, with teachers' quality? For example, like...
that's a good question. That's another good question.
Or the classroom
quality, like the sort of Chetty effect.
Exactly, yeah.
I feel like we did something related to that, but that's a good question. All right, I'm going to move on, if that's okay, because I want to get to, there's a couple things I do want to get to for sure. So I'm going to skip, there's a couple sensitivity analyses, for example, limiting attention to students where we did have their name and date of birth. We do a whole bunch of different things. We get basically similar results with different functional forms and whatnot. Now, in terms of other post-secondary outcomes, we see this fairly dramatic rise in taking a college entrance exam. It's a little less sexy than enrolling in college, but it is something that we feel pretty safe with because we can record everybody who did this, right? We don't have this sort of 20% missing colleges as we do with the National Student Clearinghouse data. Again, this is a really large number, right? So I forget what the baseline is, but I think it's a 70% rise, and I'll put this all in the summary in a second. But big rises. A lot of the post-secondary is enrollment in community college, which leads to its own set of questions, which I will discuss in the end. We don't see any movement for enrollment in four-year degree programs or earning a degree. But we do see some action for persisting to the second year.
Why is your precision so much better? Is this still black?
For which one? For the first one?
Yeah, well, it's the same magnitude.
I don't know. It's the same sample.
The means moved,
Yeah, the means moved a little bit, but I can go back and look at. Yeah, I mean, the means didn't move that much. I don't know. I don't really have a good reason for that. Okay, so for high school graduation, this is a disaster because we only observe it happen for 37% of them. So one thing we can do is just focus on the selected sample. Let's ignore the second thing because it's silly. And then the third thing was what I wanted to do, where you can sort of decide if you believe us on your own. The idea is basically to re-estimate the model over and over again with different assumptions on the probability of finishing high school for the ones we don't observe. Now, what we find is that missing students are less likely to have a black teacher. So if we assume that all of them, disappeared and went on to graduate, then we're going to get a smaller effect of black teachers on graduation because all of the ones who didn't have black teachers went off and graduated. And so we just do it over and over again, and then we kind of ask ourselves, what do we think is the right number, and what does the coefficient look like at that number? So we do the linear probability model actually for college enrollment on, this is the one where we show that being in the selected sample is related to having a black teacher. Okay, so I think that is interesting, as Stephen said, like in its own right, that there is this like attachment to school that seems to be caused by, and I'm using the causal language because this is random assignment, that is caused by having a black teacher. We can look at enrollment on the selected sample. We're going to get the same estimate, though less precisely estimated because we've massively cut the sample size down by, we've lost 2/3. But that gives us some, I don't know, maybe not, but at least we can say, well, it looks like the ones who selected in to stay in the sample look kind of similar to the ones who didn't. So why don't we just go ahead and do the LPM on the selected sample, and we get that there is this increase in the probability of graduating high school for those whom we observe. So take that with a grain of salt. The next thing we did is just, as I said, we just make guesses about what we think happened to the ones who didn't, whom we don't observe. And like I said, if you assume all of them went off and graduated, all the ones who disappeared went off and graduated, because they're less likely to have had a black teacher, that's gonna push down the coefficient. So my argument here is that this shows that there is likely to be a positive effect on high school graduation. One, all of our coefficients, no matter what, at the extremes are above 0, though they are a little insignificant. Two, roughly 70 or 67% of those who selected into the sample graduated. My presumption would be that the ones who sort of took off, and we actually have some data on how they look worse, would if anything be less likely to have graduated, so they would be kind of shifting in this direction. And that's where you start to see these positive and significant coefficients. Those are 95% confidence. So anyways, if you come away from my talk and say, like, I still don't believe the high school grad results, but I believe some of the other stuff, I'll be okay with that. This is I think the best we can do is to, and like if this is where you think it is, then it's not significant. Okay. I'm not going to talk about heterogeneity. We don't find any. This is a summary of kind of these main results. So this 4 percentage point rise in college enrollment, 4.3 percentage point rise in taking an entrance exam, and a 5 percentage point rise with all the caveats. You keep saying that just to make sure you don't forget. Rise in high school completion. The heterogeneity, well, the measures are crude. The sample size is small. And there isn't a lot of variation across students because this is like a group of poor students. So we'll be able to probe a little further on that in the North Carolina data and say a couple more things. But what I want to do is switch gears now and talk a little bit. So I have 20 minutes. I'll talk a little bit about the theory. I'm not going to go over it too much because it's a simple model. I'll try to get to the punchline fast. But I do want to talk a little bit about this this earlier literature on black teachers. So because we did, like I said, a bit of a dive in there. So what is the origin of these race match effects? And before we get anywhere, as per Eliana's question, or maybe what was going to become a question, maybe there is no race match effects. Maybe they're just better teachers overall. And this is possible because we have to keep in mind the comparison group. We're not comparing all black and white teachers. You're comparing a veteran black teacher with the 11-year-old Teach for America person that showed up, okay? I was one of those. And that's what you actually want to be looking at. So it is possible that the black teachers in the schools are just better than the white teachers in the school. Did you have a question? That was awesome, great. And we know that the black teachers in these schools have more experience, and experience is like one of the things that we can observe that actually predicts teacher quality. Okay, so this might be what's going on. Alternatively, and I'll get back to that. Alternatively, black teachers are more effective for black students. If so, why? And this is where we kind of did this like dive into the culturally relevant pedagogy literature. It actually came out of ethnographic work from after Brown v. Board of Ed, where researchers were starting to think about that there might be this perverse effect of desegregation. There was this exodus of black teachers from their profession as fully segregated schools were legislated out of existence. So black students suddenly faced fewer black teachers who were effective despite these incredibly resource-constrained schools. What is included in culturally relevant pedagogy? Using relevant examples, understanding a student's behavior correctly, visiting their home, teaching them what this guy Foster called was a hidden curricula, which included pride in their racial identity and also race-specific payoffs to education. So nailing in that education is your only ticket out of this neighborhood, which is maybe something that's a little less relevant to a middle-class white kid. We think that this relates a little bit to like the kind of Akerlof, identification stuff. They didn't use these words because this is sort of a word that people use now more, but they might not have accidentally been biased. They might not have accidentally said things that are going to hurt the kids by having low expectations. So that's, yeah.
On the North Carolina result you mentioned, where it was actually the women teachers, right? It seems like there might be an effect for just being able to interact with parents more effectively.
Yes,
right?
I think that's an absolutely great point.
And if the parents are usually moms, then.
It's a super good point, actually.
Where does language come in?
Yeah, language is who said that? Yeah, language as in like how the that's part of the culturally relevant pedagogy. Like you can actually speak. Irvine. So this is where she's the one. There are two of them that made this really neat distinction. So one, black teachers are more effective in that they teach this culturally relevant pedagogy. And she said, well, basically, there are two things that they need to do. They're cultural intercessors and translators, right? Because they're sort of this link to the middle class. And they can also just be more effective because they do things like use good examples, okay? But she also said, but they can also be role models and in the sense that they are a representation of the black middle class. Some of these ethnographies, and this is like a plug for interdisciplinary research, I think, but these ethnographies are these like octogenarians, right, who were in North Carolina actually, who had taught in segregated schools, and they interview them and they say like exactly what it is that we're kind of modeling, which is like, well, I had to sort of translate and I had to sort of, find a way to communicate with them in a way that would be effective. But I was also an example day in and day out that a black person can become a professional middle class person. That book was quoted. We can't find the book because I really want to read the whole thing, not just that one quote. So we'll find that book. Okay.
Question about.
Huh?
Karen Brown's. If this is a new book to you.
No. It's an old one. Yeah. With these ethnographies. That was the beginning of this literature.
A question here about the role model. I guess when you go to the model, are you thinking of them acting as role models for the child's parents? Or
no, for the child.
For the child?
But we can imagine different things. But
that's the thing which, like at kindergarten, I can see effectiveness mattering, but I don't know how you act necessarily as a role model for a 4-year-old. I can see that, like you see a black teacher, and that's a role model for a parent. But
it could be. I mean, I think in this model, which I'm gonna show you in like 5 minutes because I want to be quick about it. I'm very agnostic about what this actually means. So there's essentially, there's two inputs into a production function. There's some output. I don't know, whatever you want it to be, college enrollment. There's teacher effectiveness, or there's a teacher, and this is the teacher's effectiveness, and then there's some effort, and maybe you want to call that an investment. We actually fought over this term, but we landed on effort. And there's a cost of effort. Okay, so I jigged it up so you would get this really simple problem that would lead to, effort optimal is equal to beta E. Okay, so when the returns are higher, you're going to put more effort in. I mean, this is not like, okay.
So who's deciding? Who's making the effort choice?
Well, I mean, Basit says it's the parents, and I'm saying it's probably maybe the kid, and maybe it's both. We can certainly complexify this model to think about these things, right? Like I'm aware of how silly this is. Okay, so if for a given teacher, achievement over 2 periods is going to be this expression here, and the first thing you can do is say, well, if there are 2 black teachers, you're gonna and they're more effective, so the beta is higher for same race, and you have 0, 1, or 2, you can very easily show that there should be gains with each black teacher, so dosage, and increments of the difference between the effectiveness of the 2 times how many it is that you have. Yeah.
I mean, this might not matter. This might be captured in effectiveness. Does effectiveness vary with the teacher's effort? Like, does the teacher put in maybe more?
We're that's all captured in this beta here, and who knows what's in there? That you can also model a teacher decision problem.
Okay, that could also vary by class size.
That could, for example, absolutely. But that's also not like what we're trying to capture with the model, right? What we're trying to capture with the model is when we would see starkly diminishing returns. And that's why we're keeping it so simple. So black teachers as role models is going to be slightly different, where we're going to have a B squiggly saying that this is my belief about the returns to effort. Suppose I underestimate the returns to effort, or I put some probability on the effort returns being lower. Role model effects would then amount to information transmission, where the presence of a black teacher signals that there are higher returns to effort. So this is consistent with the paper that I learned about yesterday while I was looking at your presentation. Sorry, had never heard of it, but he thought of it already. Role model effects is information provision. Huh?
He's my student.
I feel better that I cited that then. There's always papers you learn about, like just any day, where I'm like, oh, okay, someone already thought of that. Okay, great. We also think that this is similar. Flavio has these kind of things on the wrong beliefs about the production function and resulting underinvestments. I think he's looking at maternal time investments. I think this is also relevant to this literature on the growth mindset that has these like spectacularly high returns when you tell a kid that like their effort's going to pay off. So now we just kind of crunch through basically that there's a true value. Your beliefs are that that there's no. This doesn't have to be 0, but either nothing or that there's some. That it's the true value. You have a prior on that. So your lambda is basically your belief that that beta is actually equal to what it truly is. And then there's this black teacher. So the probability that you have a black teacher, given that effort is the returns to effort are high, is P1. Probability of having a black teacher, given that returns to effort are low, is this, P0. That's the sense in which the teachers are providing this counterexample. And then we just get some expressions. So it's easy to show that with one black teacher, you're going to update. With the second black teacher, you're going to update again. Okay, so then the question is, all right, this is your change to optimal effort, and therefore the change to the if you have the change to the outcome. If you have a first black teacher versus a second black teacher, we want to know when would diminishing returns occur, and you get this expression that basically says the first update is the big one if the signal's really strong, or if your prior's not too low. If your prior's too low, the first one you think is a fluke, and then the second one is where you get the action. Okay, so the model kind of formalizes this distinction, and it also generates testable implications. Diminishing returns are, if you believe the model, a sufficient, not a necessary, condition for role model effects. It's sufficient because it could be that there are role model effects, but that condition doesn't hold. black teachers aren't strong enough signal, or your prior is too low, in which case you won't get diminishing returns, but it's still role model effect. So if we find diminishing returns, then we have some evidence, some good evidence that role model effects play a role. So we're going to now test all these things. The first thing we're going to test is, are they just better teachers overall? What? Yeah.
Sorry, I'm missing something.
Yes.
I thought that the idea was to identify role model effects versus teacher quality.
Yeah, teacher effectiveness. Yeah.
I don't understand why there's a difference between their empirical implications.
Oh, well,
He assumed linearity.
yeah, because I assume linearity. That's basically why. So if you have basically diminishing returns, then and teacher effectiveness, right? So if the second black teacher is so suppose that black teachers matter because they use better examples, okay, or they use better language, and so the second teacher would sort of also do that. So they would more productively transmit information to you. That's one story. The second story we're saying is, I need to just give you this piece of information that your effort in school matters. Now you have it, and I don't need to repeat it. You already have it now. So that's where we're going to get these starkly diminishing returns. That's the idea.
What I'm missing is that it would seem in a model of dynamic complementarities, anything goes in terms of
Yes.
the second one. And so
Yes. So if we complexify the model,
it's not obvious to me there's a very powerful test of one versus the other.
yeah, okay. So if we allow there to be diminishing returns to the first thing, then that goes away. And I'm curious, like what, and I mean, I want this feedback, because I mean the other way to model this is to be really simple and just say, I'm not going to model it as an update at all. I'm just going to say, I'm going to tell you something, and once I've told you, you're done. I don't need to tell you again. I mean, that's it. I mean, because there is a discrete, what we're going to show is that if you look at a dosage model, on some dimensions, the second teacher has a 0 effect.
I'm wondering, so I guess I want to make 2 points. One, I don't see on the technology, it seems to me, it has to be special to distinguish them. But there's another dimension you might want to consider.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the way that you've talked a bit, I think, alludes to something that's important, which is how do people change what they think is feasible.
Mm-hmm.
There's a literature, for example, on unforeseen contingencies. What happens if something happens you didn't think could happen, and how do you then rethink about the world? And that might have, in this context, empirical implications that you find intriguing. Somehow the Bayesian seems to me inadequate to the idea you have.
It's almost like expanding the choice set.
Yes, it's something. You know, I think that your ideas about the effect of the teacher are deeper than simply I had a lousy prior and got another observation, which is not a nice way to describe the exercise, but that's what mathematically one's doing essentially.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have a deeper idea, which is that children have a certain view of non-zero probability events, and something got added. Once you think about it that way, then clearly the first is everything, because that changed what you perceive the support to be.
This is very helpful. That might be the better way to do it. Yeah.
So can you think alternatively of working with students who had one black teacher, but exploiting whether they got it in the first or in the second year, with the idea that the role model would be, working in the same way in both cases, but for learning, it's important that you have it when you're starting to read and write, for example.
So we don't really find a whole lot with timing. We just don't in the data. So that's why that's why when we kind of tried to think about this model, we built up this kind of idea of like, how do you get starkly diminishing returns? Which, yeah, I agree with Stephen that maybe this is like not the right model. Let me sort of finish, if that's okay.
I just think there's other ways to do it.
Yeah, no. I wanted feedback on this. I'm not like sad about it. I'm happy about it. This is why you give a talk. Okay, I only have a few more minutes, and I really actually kind of want to get to the end part. So what I'm going to show you is, and you're just going to have to believe me a little bit, what we find is that on the test-taking dimension, so sitting for a test, there are starkly diminishing returns. Whereas on the college enrollment dimension, there are not. And so there are a couple of things that we're thinking about. It could be, so in college enrollment, the second black teacher matters. So the first one does too, but the second one matters. Possible conclusions. One is that role model effects are key for test taking, and not for, and similarly for enrollment, but the condition doesn't hold. Maybe the students have too low of a prior, or black teachers are not a strong enough signal. The other possibility is that for actually getting enrollment to happen, not just kind of like aspiring to college and taking a test, but actually getting to college, perhaps a second teacher matters because they build more of the infrastructure you need to do that. And we can't, with our model, we can't distinguish between those two possibilities. I think one thing that we've thought a little bit about is that, the production functions could differ across outcomes, which I don't, which maybe is worth studying a little bit more carefully.
Why not think about the distinction between personality and cognitive ability?
Yes.
Again, certainly the skills literature is suggesting
yes.
that you'd want to have a richer conception of college enrollment than
than versus college, just this aspiration to do it. Yeah, and that could have, so that's where I think a different production function would matter.
So I think it's actually quite natural to distinguish them.
Yeah. I'm gonna just not talk about North Carolina very much. So here's the thing. I'm just gonna tell you a story. There in North Carolina, you have these. This sort of universe of students, roughly 100,000 black students, 5 cohorts that entered in the 3rd grade in the 2000s. We're going to focus on persistently poor students. There's this endogenous variable, which is having had at least one black teacher in grades 3 through 5. We do that because then we can compare it to the Tennessee data. We can also say, did you have at least one black teacher? And we actually find strikingly similar results, which is kind of nice. And then there's this IV, which is basically exploiting variation that's cohort specific and grade specific and school specific in the proportion of black teachers in the school. So there were 5 black teachers out of 15 in this school, and then the next year one gets pregnant, and then somebody replaces and it's a white person, and so there's a little bit of variation in the probability that the student the next year is going to have a black teacher. That is a pretty well-known IV. The problem is, we're just going to focus on the reduced form because we don't think the IV is necessarily going to work because of role model effects. So there's lots of black teachers around in the school that the exclusion restriction doesn't hold. And there's this lovely paper where they come up with some tests where you basically stratify the sample by the treatment. And when we do that, we find that the IV has an effect on the untreated.
So if you stratify the treatment, of course the IV is got to be associated with the outcome.
No, because we've already stratified on it.
Yeah.
There's no treatment.
So we actually find.
Must be associated with
Well,
the outcome.
hold on. Actually, okay, hold on. Can I answer the question later? I have an answer. I just don't want to do it right now. Okay. So that to us is, we kind of find similar results if we buy the exclusion restriction. If we don't, we actually still get kind of similar results. Okay, so we have in my last minute, some key findings. There are these benefits. On some dimensions, role model effects may be interesting. There might be some reason for optimism here because there's this effective observable teacher characteristic. That seems incredibly effective for the most vulnerable students. Now let's do a bit of a cost benefit. (15.4% of K-12 students are black. We have 256,000 black teachers. That's 6.7%. So let's double that to align that better, which is what I think people are saying when they're like, let's diversify the teaching workforce. Thanks for your paper. That's, we looked at median earnings for black female teachers who are college educated. It's 41,000. For black female non-teachers, the smallest estimate that's realistic that we can find is 45,000. So we're asking blacks to please donate $1 billion a year to fix a problem that we caused. This This is a terrible back of the envelope calculation, but it turns out people have done this more carefully, that they actually look at who would be more likely to become a teacher, and they get between $4,000 and $5,000. So, if I can have 20 more seconds, I think we need to think a little bit about the white teaching workforce we have. Can we train them better to not engage in implicit bias? There are these light touch interventions that have shown some promise. Can we move around black teachers in a way that maybe they spend half a year with students, at least for the time being? And then one last concern is that we looked at post-secondary enrollment, which is not a terribly lucrative degree. It's not clear that our findings extend to 4-year degrees. And so that's something that we're going to need to think about in future research. That's all I have. Thank you very much for your comments.
Time for a few questions.
Could you have written a parallel paper on gender?
Probably. One of the things that we do find is we don't find white male teachers in North Carolina doing a whole lot for white students, but we do find black male teachers seem to have an outsized effect on black students, which is surprising because there's so few of them.
Right. Now, the reason I asked the question was more in the spirit of, again, triangulating the mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
And that, as you mentioned, there's a literature that suggests that there's strong gender effects.
Mm-hmm.
But now you found something interesting, which is that with reference to black students, it's ethnicity, even though almost all the teachers are female.
Yeah.
I think it's just worth thinking through what the pathways are for role
Yeah.
models versus the word that was mentioned at dinner but didn't come up here, which was aspirations,
Mm-hmm.
versus information. I mean, it's really, it's just, in terms of next steps in this,
Mm-hmm.
it seems that, you cut the data, different data sets cut along different dimensions for these types of matches.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking about the contrasting results might be useful to pinning down particular explanations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I really like Ben's point about a female teacher might be able to talk better to a mother, to a single mother, which I hadn't thought of. The other thing we were trying to figure out, and it proved too difficult to figure it out, was if we could figure out where the black teacher had grown up. So did she come from a similar, so is it really just a socioeconomic status story, not necessarily a race story, but it's just that we can't figure that out. Yeah.
So for the policy implication, so in the empirical part, you're exploiting randomization given the school, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then in the policy, it seems to me you're thinking about kind of increasing the supply of teachers of a certain type,
Mm-hmm.
coming from perhaps African American.
Mm-hmm.
Then if we think about this kind of policy, we should think about a theory of sorting, right? Because those are the
Mm-hmm.
teachers at the margin who, in the counterfactual, would come into that market, but perhaps are different from the teacher you're thinking in the randomization.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, one of the biggest problems, and like people, say this in front of a room full of black teachers. So, you want to keep quality the same because otherwise you're going to completely counteract your effects, right? So if you can't just bring like any black person into the room and say like, okay, let's have this like magic, like race match effect take place, because we're keeping constant a certain quality. Now we know that they're not worse. The ones that are teachers are not worse than black teachers, white teachers, but they're not better. Huh?
In the empirical exercise,
Yes.
because it's within school you randomize.
Sure.
But then in the counterfactual, let's say you want to increase the supply,
Mm-hmm.
then those are people who in the baseline wouldn't do that job, but then they do that job, and perhaps are different than the one that really do.
Yeah, they might be
Yeah.
terrible at it. That's right.
They'll certainly be less experienced.
They'll certainly be less experienced, which we know is no good.
What is the share of teachers in the school?
That are black?
Yeah.
It depends on the schools. I'm really bad at remembering numbers if I don't have them up. 44%. Oh no, it's 44% of 44% of students have black teachers. No, 43. Yeah.
That's pretty large.
But in schools where the student had a black teacher, it's 60. And in schools where students had a white teacher, it's 30. Yeah, that's high. These are urban schools where there are a lot of black teachers.
But these are summary statistics only for black students.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And can you see if they become teachers or no?
No.
Not really.
Wait, actually, can't they? Do they become teachers? That's a good question. Maybe. Well, because we don't see it. I don't know.
Teddy's theory would let you do that. Right? Because you fill out an occupation.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We tried to match. I mean, what we'd like to have done is match the NSC and NSC to the North Carolina, but they were like, no, we're not doing this. Our results had already come out, and I think they were getting some flack about that. We were saying that white teachers are bad, and so they just said no, with no explanation. Just not doing that.
You have this fight about the econometric issue now, the exclusion restriction.
Oh yeah.
Or did that get resolved?
No.
Oh. Yeah. Sure.
Could you repeat the original claim? I think you said that.
Okay,
that
so
conditional on treatment.
So
the
if
instrument and the outcome should not be associated.
Yeah,
And
so that's
I'm
the
saying that's not true.
conditional on no. So the first thing I'm going to say is conditional on not treatment. They should be not associated, right? So that's it. We're already dead, right? However, conditional on not treatment, because then there's the if I've already conditioned on you not being treated, but the instrument has an effect on you, then the exclusion restriction doesn't hold. So far so good.
Or the selection problem. You can't.
We're gonna assume that the selection problem is not an issue. This is purely about the exclusion restriction.
Yeah. So there's unobserved.
No. But I don't want. We're not going to talk. This is not about endogeneity. Let's assume this is a nice exogenous instrument. So that's one thing that's holding. And then two, let's look at let's think about exclusion restriction. If the exclusion restriction holds, and you're untreated, the instrument should have no effect on you. So far, so good?
Yes.
Okay. Now, we can also look at, and this I don't think is really from your paper, but maybe it is. If we look at the treated, it might be there's an issue because he's looking at like a yes/no outcome, and it might be that we're looking at a yes/no outcome, but that there are some students who we're looking at kind of a continuous outcome. It might be that there's some students had like 2 or 3 black teachers, and that we're picking up that additional thing. So that's where that would be another issue. That's why. That's how I see it. You can. I mean, it's your paper. You can tell me if I'm right.
It's just, if you maintain a conditional independence assumption, and you have an instrument, you can then think of the test as being a test of the exclusion restriction.
I mean, to me,
what we use it for actually is the reverse. We use it for whether there's evidence of selection.
Yeah.
But they're equivalent tests. We're just, you're essentially rejecting.
We're flicking it around, yeah. But I mean, but I think that the biggest thing is that like we're finding treatment on the untreated via the ID. So we're like that can't be.
It either has to be selection on observables or a violation of the exclusion restriction.
And we have good reason to believe from a theoretical level that there's a problem with the exclusion restriction because you have a bunch of black teachers around. So I think might be role models.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.